Good evening all, and welcome. I would like to wish you a very Merry Christmas indeed. I hope you have a great day. In any case, we have come here for spooks, and you'll be pleased to see the time on the video that we have an extra long installment this year, as a thank you for your continued viewership and amazing support. Let's hope next year is going to be even better. So for now, it's time for you to all get comfortable by your fires. Close your eyes and let the darkness take control. Personally, the last half of 2017 has been pretty exhausting. The most draining part, both emotionally, physically, and financially, has been the laborious task of moving my father into an aged care home facility due to his rapidly advancing dementia. He lives in Tasmania, where I grew up. I am currently living and working in Brisbane, which is about 2,500 kilometers north of Tasmania, or 1,500 miles for you Imperials. I have been making the 3.5-hour flight down to Tasmania about twice a month to sort out my dad's situation. I have been busying myself by fixing up his empty, dilapidated home in order to prepare it to be sold. I moved out all of his furniture and belongings, save for a pile of blankets and pillows that I turn into a makeshift bed on the floor while I'm visiting. The house is situated in a semi-rural area, surrounded by overgrown trees and bushes. It's an old house. It's damp. Everything creaks, and there is currently no electricity, which makes the nighttime very creepy. The house itself is also not very secure. No alarm system, the doors have locks, but a forceful nudge will pop the door open. I flew in on Christmas Eve in the late evening, picked up my hire car to make the hour-long drive down to the house. I stopped in at a mate's place who lives about 10 minutes from my dad's to have a few beers and shoot the shit about the year that just passed. After a couple of hours, I realized I had probably surpassed the legal blood alcohol limit to drive. My mate's legendary wife dropped me off at my dad's and offered to come back in the morning to pick me up and go back to their place to get my car. A true Christmas miracle. I entered my dad's house around midnight. Inside the house was pitch black, and in my slightly drunken state I flipped the light switch on, and nothing happened. Oh yeah, that's right. No power. Using my phone as a light to navigate my way through the house over the creaky floorboards, I noticed that some of the tools that I had left lying around inside the house had been stolen. I sighed and accepted the fact that it was my own stupid fault for leaving them out in an unsecure house. Some kids probably noticed that no one was living there and took advantage of the situation. It was unsettling knowing that someone had been here, but I didn't bother calling the police over a hammer, wrench, and screwdriver that came to a grand total of about $16.50. Good news was the big toolbox which I kept locked up in the laundry cupboard that houses my more expensive power tools was still there intact. I studied the padlock and the space around it. It looked pretty scratched up and dented, like someone had crudely attempted to prise it open. Nice try, dickheads, I said aloud to myself. The toolbox is very big and heavy, and too big for one person to carry it, unless you're Andre the Giant. Exhausted, I went into one of the furnitureless bedrooms and made my makeshift bed out of the blankets and pillows. I couldn't get comfortable, and it was taking me a while to drift off to sleep. As I was laying there, I could hear the gentle rustle of the wind through the trees. I could also hear what sounded like the unmistakable crunch of boots on the gravel driveway that went up the side of the house. I tried to listen harder, Then there was a loud gong sound of something solid coming in contact with the metal railing that leads up to the back door. This makes me sit up wide-eyed while my heart rate starts to increase. Maybe it was a wallaby or a possum. I sit there, as still as possible, just listening. I can hear the sound of the trees in the wind and nothing else for a few moments, and I start to calm down. This is then interrupted by the pop and squeak of the back door being pushed open. Shit. I freeze, not knowing what to do. I could hear the footsteps creaking through the back of the house, and I hear the laundry cupboard being opened. I was at the other end of the hallway, but I could hear whispering. The only words I could make out were, "Shh, quick, there." I pull myself together and pull out my phone and call the police. I chat to the dispatcher while burying my head under the pillow to muffle my voice. I explain the situation to the dispatcher, and she says the police are on their way. While this is happening, I can hear a chink sound of what I'm assuming was the lock of the toolbox trying to be broken. The dispatcher suggests that I lock the door of the room I'm in. I agree, and as I slowly pad over across the room to the door, one of the floorboards creaks so freaking loudly. I freeze and hear dead silence from the laundry. They must have heard. After about 30 seconds of standing still, I try to take another step and get yet another high-pitched creak. But this seems to work in my favor, because I hear my new house guests scatter away out the back door. I lock the bedroom door and tell the dispatcher that I think they've left. She tells me to stay put until the police arrive, and I tell her that I'm more than happy to comply. After 5 minutes later, the cops arrive and the dispatcher bids me farewell. The police did a search of the area and found nothing as expected. They had tried to break open the toolbox. One of the cops says, "Why didn't they just use bolt cutters?" Amateurs. And we have a little laugh. I explained to the police about how when I came home some of the tools that I left lying around were stolen, and that the toolbox looked like it had already been attempted to be broken into. Upon hearing that, the other cop stated his theory of how the events took place. They probably broke in earlier tonight before you got here, grabbed what they could, and tried to open the toolbox but couldn't, and then left to go get something to open it with. While they were gone, you came home, and then they arrived back here to open the toolbox. I doubt they were dangerous, probably just kids. Good timing, I think to myself. I'll make a report and that's that. I stayed up until sunrise, and then decided to get a couple of hours sleep until my mate's wife, Lucy, came to pick me up to collect my car. I asked if I could keep my tools at their place for safekeeping, to which they agreed. I drove down to my dad's old folks' home and had Christmas lunch with him and his new elderly buddies. The following day, I go to the hardware store and purchase some newer, sturdier door locks. Nobody knew at the time, but my boss invited the staff over for an annual Christmas party at his apartment that he shared with his boyfriend at the time. So we went. We ate, we drank, we met one of the nicest men I've ever met in my life. His name was Bruce MacArthur. He was a landscaper, good cook, and even better serial killer. Turns out that this guy ended up luring at least 8 men through gay hookup apps, only to murder them, cut up their body, and bury their body parts in the garden of various houses he worked on around the city. Nonetheless, when I saw his name and face on the news, the Christmas party came to mind, and I recalled the sweet boyfriend of my boss who I met, and was a great host. It's just crazy to think that someone who you get absolutely no weird vibes from ends up being one of the most demented criminals in the history of Toronto. I'm honestly not sure how my boss made it out of the relationship unscathed, and he's no longer my boss, but I'd love to call him up and see his thoughts on this news in Toronto on his ex-lover dismembering countless men. This happened to my very close family friends on Christmas Day a few years ago. I used to babysit for this family starting around age 12, and I later house and dog sat for them months at a time, all throughout my 20s. This story is particularly creepy for me, because I have spent a ton of time alone in their house. So this family is enjoying a stereotypical Christmas Day evening in the family home. It's a drizzly, wet, foggy night outside. It's a large family, and the kids are all grown and in their mid-20s to 30s, most with jobs out of state, but everyone has come home to be together for the holidays. Siblings are busy playing with Christmas loot. TVs are on, Christmas music is playing, food is being cooked and eaten, and there's a lot of laughing and talking. This persists for many hours. The youngest daughter spots her dad standing in the middle of the courtyard outside in a black hooded sweatshirt. The hood is over his head, so just his mouth and chin are visible, and he's just looking in the house. She casually calls over to her mum, who's in the kitchen, to check on Dad, because it seems he needs help with something in the yard. Except, Mum said, Dad's in the bedroom taking a nap. Mum and sister quickly come to the realization that there's a creepy stranger in a black hoodie just staring at them, not moving on Christmas Day evening. As you can imagine, the family collectively craps enough bricks to build another chimney for Santa. They then proceed to alert everyone in the house, run around checking the locks on many sliding glass doors and windows, and wake up Dad. In the meantime, Dark Hoodie Creep can see everyone's movements because the house is pretty much completely glass window walls. This guy continues to stand there in intentional creepy Jason-like pose, not moving, except now he's wearing a sinister smile on his face. It's obvious that he is enjoying being caught. At first, the family thinks this might be a practical joke of some kind. The family members start to call out things to intimidate him like, "If this is a joke, it's not funny. We already called the cops. We have a gun." But the guy keeps standing there, smiling and not moving for a long time. Then suddenly, he rushes up to the glass and starts pounding on it, still not saying a word, his face obscured by the hood. Obviously, he is intentionally trying to scare everyone, if not break into the house, and now the family really does call the cops. After pounding on the glass for a good while, he runs and hops to the fence near the home's trash can and heads to the neighbor's yard. The neighbors are also good friends, so the family calls them to let them know what's happening, but they never see the hooded man. The cops arrive within minutes, take statements, check all the neighboring houses, but never find the guy. Not long after, the family had their courtyard area completely remodeled, including a new security and light system. The scariest bit of this story for me is that they have no idea how long this guy was just standing there, watching them enjoy their Christmas. The home where this took place is in a quiet upper-class neighborhood. It's a square home with an interior square courtyard, situated on the edge of a steep hill with a busy 6-lane road below. It would have been very difficult to climb this hill and scale the back wall to access the back porch area, and harder still to escape down without falling into the traffic below. It also would have been hard to exit the neighborhood unless climbing through people's yards without being spotted by the cops. The home is angled in such a way that the wind blows right through it, causing creaks and draft sounds on even mildly windy days. A rustle or crunch sound would most likely be ignored. The home's layout is similar to many traditional Japanese homes, with sliding doors attached to each section of the house, leading to the square middle courtyard. Except rather than wooden panels or screens, this home is all sliding glass window hallways. The home is beautiful, but they have some creepy art, and has a floor-to-roof iron gate which is impossible to climb over, and a wooden gate, possible to climb, leading to a trash can and storage area adjacent to the neighbor's wooden fence. These are the only accessible points to the central courtyard. My conclusion is this guy must have been a crazy ex or school friend playing a prank on one of the now adult kids. But many years have passed, and it was never revealed and seems unlikely. Perhaps this guy just had mental problems, or was a peeping Tom. Or maybe this was a Home Alone type situation, where the guy was squatting in nice homes counting on the fact that people wouldn't be home for the holidays, and possibly decided to have some fun with this family once he spotted us. I seriously doubt this single guy was actually planning to take on a family with 6+ adults. I've not stayed alone in the house since, as the dog I used to watch passed away some time ago, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on this chilling experience. One Christmas Eve, my mum, sister and I were driving back from a very late family gathering. Our house is 20 minutes from the party. I think I was about 18, my sister 14, and our house was in a new development, but the drive there was rather solitary, kind of through the woods. The highway was one of those winding highways along a river, where you drive about 40 miles an hour max. To the right was all woods, and to the left the river. There's one turn-off road onto a small bridge to the left a few miles before you turn off. This night I remember sitting in the front seat, kinda drowsy and ready for sleeping. It must have been 2 a.m. My mum always used to drive really slowly, which drove me nuts. It would always irritate me. She'd also tap the brakes constantly. This night we were driving along, and just before a bend in the road, a few feet past the bridge, there was a car positioned perpendicular to us, that is, blocking the road. There were 2 men sitting in the car looking at us, not trying to turn around or anything, just blocking the road. My mum slammed on the brakes, and I've never seen her move so quickly. She cursed, threw her car in reverse, and turned into the bridge to turn around, because at the end of the bridge, on the other side, another car had blocked the other road. I just remember my heart slamming against my ribs. I had no idea what was going on, but I do remember my mum saying something like, these men were up to no good. She'd lived in Mexico City in the 70s and had lots of experience with crime and shady situations. The idea that something terrible was planned was brought home when we saw the other guy blocking the end of the bridge. My mum managed to turn the car around and hit the gas, and we got the hell out of there. We drove back to my aunt's house and called the cops. They took a long time and finally gave us a police escort back home. I never drove home that way again. I took the longer route on another road, and we never did find out what those guys were up to. But after all the crime stories I've read, I can imagine. It was really scary. I'm glad my mum was a cautious driver, and that she surprised me with her skill. So if you drive a long, scary, desolate, lonely road home, drive slowly. and be on the lookout like my mum was. My family and I were searching for a new house for two reasons. One, so that my brother and I could get separate rooms as we were getting too old to share. And two, because our current neighborhood was going downhill, and my parents wanted me to grow up in a safe environment. The house was old looking, a row home, and the interior mostly carved wood, done by the people who lived in the house. We spoke to the owners, a husband, wife, and the husband's dad, an older man who had an oxygen tank and couldn't speak. He, in his youth, had been a wood carver and done the house interior, as well as teach his son the trade. The father had done a lot of woodwork in the living room and floors, while the son had made at least some cabinets in the kitchen. Charming 12-year-old me spent some time speaking to the owners, and they seemed quite smitten. This is the odd part of the story. My parents were in the kitchen speaking to the owners, and me and my brother wandered off in curiosity and hid in the porch closet. My parents called to us when it was time to go, but we didn't answer. They left without us and began walking down the street. The wife opened the closet and told us that she'd seen us going in there and didn't want to rat on us, but we'd better catch up with our parents, and sent us off with a smile. We did just that. It wasn't odd or creepy at the time. It was nice. I presume she whispered to our parents where we were, and that they knew that we'd be fine. But I don't know. It's only now, when looking back on it, that it seems odd, but not altogether pertinent to the story. A short amount of time passes, and we return to the home to close the deal. Apparently, my parents offered less than the owners wanted, but it was still an acceptable amount. The wife, during this meeting, asked me if I was excited to have my own room, and of course I responded yes, and she then implied that she would love for me to have my own room, and so the negotiations went into full effect. My parents would later say, perhaps to be nice, the house was only sold to them because the wife said I deserved my own room, which I thought was super cool at the time. My parents showed me upstairs, and the room that would be mine. It was quite small, about the size of a pickup truck, but my parents implied they'd make it bigger. It was a basic room, and in fact belonged to the silent father of the husband. At the realtor's, the wife implied we should leave the room as it is. This worried me, and I sat quietly upstairs in my room, and sad that it would remain small. In the car on the way home, however, my father told me not to worry. It would be our house and we could do as we pleased. He would later change the upper flooring, combining my room with a closet and a bathroom, and shifting things around as such so that my room would be larger. As soon as we could, my dad started working on the house, and we stayed in our old house packing up and getting ready. It was close to Christmas, and my father was determined to get us home by then. He did, and it was early December when we finally moved in. The work that had to be completed was the upstairs, so we all had bedrooms and could sleep there, but overall there was still work to be done. Typically, a house makes noises, especially a new one with construction, but all the noises seemed to originate from the area where the parlor and dining room met. It sounded like a shoe squeaking against hardwood floors, which the whole middle floor had. The middle floor being where the parlor and dining room and kitchen were. There was the upstairs where the bedrooms were, and a basement that was mostly storage and where the washing machines lived. The washing machines were located in the back under the kitchen. There were noises and scratchings around my room, which I tried to ignore, but were frightening to 12-year-old me in a new house, in a room by myself for the first time. And after this event, everything got worse. All hands were on deck to redo the basement. My father, brother, and I began to break up the walls, as inside them there were what seemed to be filler, but not in massive quantities. It had chunks of rocks and old newspapers, which we showed my mum out of curiosity. But then we found something different. Located in the wall in a section of the house just under where the parlor and dining room met, we found a photo. A sepia photo of an older woman just older than me. Now younger. She must have been in her 20s. It had a thin but wide cardboard frame around it. The woman did not look happy, but that was to be expected, as smiling wasn't a normal thing in the time of these pictures. Her hair was up in a bun, and her dress was dark and poofy. The size of it was slightly smaller than a postcard. This, of course, we showed to my mother, which she decided we should keep because of how cool it was, and we kept it in the kitchen leaning against a flower pot. The kitchen was below my brother's room, and above the basement section of the house. My mother also reminded me during this time the piping problem led to the toilets overflowing several times. The next morning there was a problem with the water. It wasn't flowing right, and we tried to solve it to no avail. We called a plumber who wouldn't arrive until the next day, and the morning of the next day in the washing section of the basement, the pipes in the walls had burst, and the walls were leaking. We didn't know this at the time. We originally only saw the leaking walls and were wondering what happened. It was a relief the plumber was coming, as he snaked the pipes and found a large piece of brick inside them. No explanation how. We weren't working with bricks, and it didn't match up to the house. He told us, however, the piping in the walls and the one with the brick were not directly connected, and thus the two had developed issues independently. The house was continually full of noises, typical of a new house. However, sometimes my father would pass out on the couch after working so hard. This, of course, after a beer or two and several cigarettes. His sleeping pattern would be interrupted by empty beer cans hitting the floor in the kitchen. He said that sometimes he would push the beer cans deep into the trash, only to have them later that night crash onto the floor. They weren't just sitting on the top. I only ever experienced this event once, and can assure you the trash was not filled up to the brim, and even had a lid on the can. So the beer had to have been at least 8 inches in to travel up and get over the lip to get out. My dad, despite this, didn't believe in paranormal things and is pretty dedicated to his religious beliefs, but also does not deny to this day the events. My mother was stressed by problems we were having with construction, and Christmas coming, so she bought a small statue of Mary, in hopes to bring joy to the house and have the Lord bless it, which she placed in the kitchen next to the picture of the woman. The next morning, the statue was found on the floor. Mary's hands were broken off, and she was across the room, and she'd travelled at least 24 inches from the window's ledge, and the hands a good 7 feet from the ledge. My father found this and repaired the statue with superglue, but at this point, almost jokingly, my mother, brother, and I blamed the picture and began to research the house. We pulled up no information that was conclusive of an identity, but did find one woman's nickname. It was the name of the wife of the father of the husband who sold us the house, the man who was sick and couldn't talk. He had been the owner before his son, along with his wife, Catherine. So to make that clear, the father of the man who sold us the house, he and his wife were the only prior owners we could locate, or at least that's as far back as we could find. No proof that the photo was of her, but the timing would add up. The father was in his late 80s, and we met them in 2005, and the photo was of a woman in perhaps her 20s, so we're talking the photo being taken in the 50s, and so the time would add up. But as I said, no evidence. The writing on the back of the photo was one word: sloppy and unreadable. My brother's ceiling began to leak due to snow. His room was above the kitchen, above the photo. We've yet to properly repair damage from that till this day. We noticed all the activity was either above or below the photo. My mum wanted a priest to come out, and this is where my father's faith shook a bit, and agreed that my mum wasn't totally crazy for wanting it, but he still didn't believe it was the photo. He was skeptical, but was no longer frustrated with our obsession over the photo and the odd events. It was Christmas time, and the priest was busy, and said he would come back another time to bless the house. I snooped around and found my Christmas gifts in the basement, as that's where my parents had hid them. Christmas Eve night comes, and I'm in bed, wide awake with anticipation. I hear my parents go slightly up the hall to my brother's door to listen for noise, then to my door, then to his. They kept roaming the halls to check on us and to move the toys, but I soon noticed they weren't going down the stairs with them, and the gifts weren't on this floor. Eventually, noises stopped. In the morning, I casually asked my parents about it, and they, still slyly trying to deny the real magic of Christmas, said Santa had a hard time pulling the gifts out, considering the kids kept walking up and down the hall trying to spy on their gifts. My brother said he heard the noises too, and thought the same, that I was trying to spy on my gifts. I told them it wasn't the case and that it wasn't me. My dad seemed to not believe me. He thought I was spying, but my mother was more convinced. In later years, they revealed all the toys were in the basement, and that it really wasn't them in the hall. Christmas night, I woke up late with my toys. I couldn't sleep. It was early, maybe 2 a.m., when someone came to check on me. I could hear and see the doorknob rattle so slightly, like someone was trying to get into the room without waking me. The door was locked and I whispered, "I'm still awake, Mum," but no answer, and I didn't hear anyone walk from the door, nor did I hear anyone walk up to it. I opened the door and my parents' door was closed. They were asleep. This was one of the only nights I was awake late, and my brother reported similar goings-on, and that he often heard someone walking up to his door. He said it mostly happened between 3 and 5 a.m., at the time when little me was fast asleep. In fear, he had brought a knife from his friend. He's only 3 years older than me, so he was about 15 while this was going on. The priest comes in early January, and we describe the events. I don't remember too much of what he said, except that he had an exchange with my mum, where she told him what was going on. So he put his hand on his shoulder, comforted her by name, and with his hand raised a Bible in the other and said, "We cast out whatever negative energies reside in this home, so that the family may live in peace." He finished by a sprinkle of holy water. He did this in several places, but I only remember him specifically sprinkling it in one wall. Before he left, at my mother's request, he gave her a Mary magnet to replace our broken statue which went on the fridge in the kitchen. In the morning, I went down for breakfast and found the magnet missing. I located my father in the basement and told him I couldn't find it. He said not to tell my mother, but he found it when he got home from work. as he started working midnight shift, which made it even harder for me, her, and my brother to be home at night. It was on the floor, broken, hands off. For the record, the fridge was across the room from the photo. He had it there and wanted to repair it as well, but said he couldn't find the hands. We have no pets, and no one in the family would break property like that. It never happened, before or since, and my dad told my mother, and my mother wanted the priest to return. But he said he couldn't do it, that he was busy and not to worry. My father was upset. He didn't know what to believe, but he only expressed frustration with the fact that his family didn't feel safe. He didn't want to miss work, but my mum didn't want to be in the house alone at night, and selling this new house would cost them a lot, which wasn't really an option. Noises continued, and my brother was increasingly upset, saying he didn't sleep much. It was during this time that my brother changed. It's a private and touchy subject, and likely nothing to do with it. But due to insomnia and depression, he turned to an alternate means of coping, and has never been the same since. These decisions were made during the time the photo was present in the house, located under his bedroom. My mum was the first one to point out only a few weeks ago, and my brother did, however, say in times of clarity, the noises kept waking him at night and were a major problem for him. Late January, school. They wanted us to do a project on spirits and ghosts and talk about our feelings with them. As I remember, it was a mostly anti-ghost agenda, as they weren't considered part of the religion. I brought in the photo with my story. My mum was hesitant despite the terrible goings-on, as we were equally fascinated by the events. I made the teacher promise to give it back after my presentation, and the paper was graded. I told my class the story, a group of 12 and 13-year-olds. As this was late January and my birthday had just occurred, they were shocked and asked many questions, but my teacher didn't believe me. Long story short, the photo was thrown away, possibly on purpose. My mum had thrown a fit at the school, but there was no way to retrieve it. She told them my story was true, but the school with their religious ways didn't understand why we'd want it. We eventually got on with life, stopped talking about the photo, as it was gone. With the photo gone, the house grew quiet. A month or two later, George, husband of Catherine, the woman we believed to be in the photo, passed away. He was old and sick, so it wasn't sudden, but odd to us. His wife had obviously passed many years ago. My mum wondered if he'd died of a broken heart, having moved out of a house which the interiors had been primarily built by his own hands or his sons. Nothing more ever happened. We still occasionally get mail for the deceased old man. This is all the information I have, and I'll say this. I don't know what you think. All these years later, everything seems odd, but not impossible. I don't go around screaming my house was haunted. I still don't say it. All I say is this. It happened, and I thought I'd share it here, because it's worth telling. In my grandparents' house, there are 2 doors in the hallway. One leads to the kitchen, and the other one leads straight into the living room. Bear this in mind for the purpose of the story. There is a tradition in Finland called Päivä, which has been spread in here from Sweden. It is celebrated on the 13th day of January. That specific day ends the peace of Christmas, and usually the Christmas tree will be thrown away during that day, or planted if it's still alive. The tradition also involves children dressed up as Notipuki, a creature that has the head of a goat, and they will then proceed to move from house to house to sing songs. I was about 4 or 5 years old when this happened. I was in my grandparents' house with my family, and there were also other relatives present there. I was alone in another room trying to watch TV, while the others were gathered in the living room. I got pretty bored with the program and decided to head into the living room with the others. As soon as I made it into the living room, the door from the left side of the room swung open, and in walked about 12 teenagers dressed up as Notipuki. Their costumes were poorly made, but they still managed to make them look insanely terrifying. They had robes and long coats, weird masks made of cardboard, and antlers made of twigs on their heads. One of them even had a realistic-looking goat skull with black eye holes. They also made some weird and creepy noises and stomped inside. Needless to say, I was totally freaked out by this, so I turned around and quickly ran into the room where I came from. If you Google Notipuki, I'm sure you'll understand why I was terrified. It's probably the worst childhood memory I have. For some context, my mother was a very religious and overprotective woman. Because of this, my oldest sister rebelled in her teenage years by drinking, smoking pot, and dating bad boys. My sister became the black sheep of the family, and even when she did good things like win an art contest, become a manager of a local fast food restaurant, got her own apartment, and fully supported herself at 19, she could not win the approval of our mother. At that point in her life, my sister was getting tired of dating jerks who left her broken-hearted and with low self-esteem. My mother believed my sister could get on the right path if she just found a good and decent husband. Yes, this was my mother's mentality. Disgusting. My mother insisted that she set my sister up with the right kind of guy, because clearly my sister was incapable of choosing a partner herself. Surprisingly though, my sister agreed out of desperation and loneliness, and soon enough my mother announced that she had a friend whose brother was the right kind of guy. He was a good-looking youth minister and loved kids. Oh, and the only catch was that he was a bit older. 33 years old. What 19-year-old girl wants to date a 33-year-old? My sister immediately said no way. However, my mother persisted and begged my sister to just go on one date and give him a chance. My sister agreed, but she would only meet him if it was a group thing. We ended up going bowling as a group, me, my older sister, my middle sister, and this guy, and he had brought along his 14-year-old niece. As it turned out, he was quite handsome. He had blonde hair, a golden tan, and was fairly muscular. He was very friendly and outgoing. My sister was smitten right away. However, throughout the evening I got some weird vibes from the 14-year-old niece. She was very clingy with her uncle. She either had her arms wrapped around him or sat on his lap the entire evening. This seemed a bit inappropriate at her age. She also made some strange comments to my older sister, such as, "If you date my uncle, then I guess I won't be able to spend as much time with him." She then feigned a pouty face, and in return he tickled her. That's just weird. So my sister and this guy started dating, and 6 months later, it looked like they were going pretty serious. In fact, my sister had told me she even thought he was going to propose soon. Our mother was thrilled. I still felt weirded out by this guy. Anyway, it was Christmas time, and my mother invited him to our family Christmas celebration. This was monumental. You never brought a boyfriend or girlfriend to family Christmas if it wasn't serious. My sister was the happiest I have ever seen her. At this point, I had just moved into an apartment which I shared with my middle sister. One evening, I got a call from my oldest sister's boyfriend. He made some small talk and asked me if I would be at family Christmas. I said I would. Then he asked me if I could assist him in picking out a Christmas gift for my sister. He said it had to be special, and he'd really like my input. I told him I was sure she'd like anything he selected, but he insisted that he come over, pick me up, and we drive to the mall to select something. First off, we lived in a really small town, and the nearest mall was 70 miles away. Secondly, I was still just 17 years old, 2 weeks away from my 18th birthday, and was not about to get into a truck and drive an 140-mile round trip with a guy I felt uncomfortable with. I made the excuse that I was going to the movies with some friends and would not be able to assist him, but I suggested that maybe he get her a necklace. A few days later, I was coming out of my apartment with a friend when a truck pulled up into the parking spot right in front of my door. The window rolled down, and it was my sister's boyfriend. I greeted him, and he asked again if I would go to the mall with him to help him pick out that gift. I swear at this point, the blood in my veins ran cold. I was very uncomfortable and told him I was just heading out with my friend. He insisted she could come along too, but we declined, and he was almost to the point of begging. We finally began to walk off, waving bye and not looking back. My friend told me to tell my older sister about it, but I knew she was so taken with him that she would think I was just being paranoid, so I didn't mention it to her. Then, the night before Christmas, I had just gotten home from work, and as I entered the apartment I could hear my phone ringing. I did not get to it in time, so assumed they would call back if it were important. I didn't have a caller ID nor answering machine then, but just a minute later, the ringing started again. I answered. It was my sister's boyfriend. I really just wanted to hang up, but remained polite. He started off the conversation by telling me he picked up a gift at the mall. It was a necklace as I had suggested, and he said it had a heart-shaped pendant, and what I thought of it. That's great, I told him, as I thought my sister would really like it. But then he began to stumble over his words and said, I have something to tell you. That necklace isn't for your sister. It's for you. I was silent and unsure how to respond. He continued, Actually, I have a secret. I'm gonna break up with your sister tonight because I'm not in love with her. I'm in love with you. This whole time I just wanted to be closer to you. I wanted to throw up. I hung up the phone and had no idea what to say other than shout profanities at him. This sick creep was more than just interested in younger girls. He was going to completely shatter my sister's happiness. I fretted for the next hour about what to do. Then finally my phone rang. It was my oldest sister. She was sobbing and crying. She was in hysterics, saying that her boyfriend had broken up with her and ruined Christmas. She said he told her he wasn't in love with her, and that's it. I couldn't tell her what he said to me. I didn't want to hurt her even more, but I did tell my mom and other sister, and we all agreed it was best not to tell her. However, my mother did ask his sister to tell him that I was a minor and to leave me alone. A couple of weeks later, on my 18th birthday, I got a phone call from the creep. He wished me a happy birthday and asked if he could take me out on a birthday date. I was so angry. I told him no way, and that I was not interested in him. I told him I was furious about how he treated my sister, and I never wanted him to call me again. But he did call again, and again, and again. The last call happened to be in front of my oldest sister. I told him to never call me again, or I was going to call the cops. My sister made me tell her what was going on, and she was furious. She called him back and said, "Don't you ever call my little sister again. You stay away from her. If you do, I will hunt you down." She was fierce. She slammed the phone down and told me that I should have told her right away. I said I didn't want to hurt her, and she said I was more important than anything, and she'd make sure he stayed away from me. I think he did, although I did see his truck pass by my work a few times. What is probably the most disturbing thing about this guy is his weird relationship with his niece. She was 3 years younger than me, but she was actually taller than myself, and I looked much younger. Could he have been in an inappropriate relationship with his niece, and then saw an opportunity to be with a young girl who looked even younger, but was soon to be legal? It wouldn't surprise me. The only way he could get to me was through my sister, so he strung her along by his sick plan. It's very disturbing to know he was a youth minister, in a position of trust and around many children. I have no idea where the creep is now, but I really hope he's behind bars, wearing a jumpsuit. I was about 10 years old, living outside of Cincinnati, Ohio. Thanksgiving had just passed, and it was partially cold weather that year. I can't remember why my mother and older brother weren't at home at the time, but my father, a barber in the city, was upstairs preparing for work. I had just set up a new dartboard that I got as an early Christmas present from distant family at Thanksgiving earlier in the week, when I heard a car door slam and tires burn out quite loudly. Running out to the door to peek outside, my vision of the intersection is blocked by a tree. My father, hearing my footsteps in a hurry, yells down, "It's just that kid down the street. He's about to buy new tires, so he's roasting the old ones." I go back to throwing darts, and just a few moments later, as my 10-year-old brain is reasoning the logic my father has yelled down, I think to myself, why did he slam the door though? As I'm holding on to this thought, I hear the sound of glass clinking together. It gets louder and has a beat to it, like if you took a bag of marbles and hit them like a drum. From what I can only explain as intuition, this seemingly harmless sound absolutely terrifies me. One last pause, and then it meets me on the other side of my door. I'm paralyzed with fear as a man begins pounding on the door. I'm only feet away, and at an angle I can't see out clearly. I scream at the top of my lungs for my father, and I hear him racing down the stairs as my ridiculous self is on autopilot, opening up the front door for some weird reason, and my dad lands directly behind me, having jumped down the last staircase due to my gut-wrenching scream. The door, wide open, reveals a young man, completely naked, beaten, bloodied, taped at the mouth, and tied from head to toe in old-fashioned Christmas lights. He falls in our doorway, and my father immediately slams the door and locks it. My fear is completely gone. The man is crying, talking through the tape, tied in the fetal position on our floor. I reach down and take the tape off, and as I do, my father grabs me and launches me up onto the staircase, telling me to call 911 now. I sprint for the upstairs phone, dial 911, and I'm sounding off every detail and fact I can think of that they need to know. As I'm heading back downstairs, my father has thrown a very old navy pea-colored coat at the man and is gingerly removing the duct tape from his mouth. I'll never forget the look in the man's eyes, welled with tears, breathing heavily, as he finally calms himself for the first time in a long time. As the tape comes off, he busts out into a full-fledged howling cry. The kind of cry that comes from the soul. My dad looks away. He cried like that, still tied up, with the pea coat covering him until the cops arrived 10 minutes later. Even they couldn't get him untied. He must have had 100 feet of vintage Christmas lights tying his hands together and then his waist down to his feet and back up again. I overheard an officer say that he must have been tied up like that for a while, as the smaller cord was embedded in his skin. An officer talking to my father pointed at me and told me to get in the house. They walked up onto the porch just enough for me to hear their conversation behind the door. The man of 32 years old had pulled over to the side of the road to help a stranded motorist, someone who he thought was alone, but had an accomplice hiding nearby. When this good Samaritan offered to help in changing the flat tire, he was knocked over the head and put into the trunk of the car. The two men took him to an abandoned building and first tied him up with rope. They repeatedly beat and sexually assaulted him for 3 days until he escaped, only to be captured on the road and this time tied up with Christmas lights. This went on for weeks apparently. How long, I'm still not sure, as we never got the man's name and it was never reported in the news. My dad reported the police station a few days later, but no one would tell him a thing. I remember the tire marks in our intersection stayed there for what seemed like years. I'm telling you this story tonight as I've recently began listening to stories on YouTube, which compelled me to share my own. I haven't spoken about this in years. I'm 31 now, and every single year around Thanksgiving, I think about that man and how strange that was. I am now also terrified of the sound of glass clinking together. I was 5 years old, and my mum was going into labor with my younger brother. I stayed at my grandparents' house while my mother was in the hospital. I shared the queen bed with my grandfather, who was soundly asleep and snoring. At some point late in the night, I was awoken by the bed shaking quite vigorously. It persisted for 5 minutes, and I tried to shake my grandfather awake while calling for him to wake up. He eventually woke groggily, but had no clue when I asked him what was happening. He quickly fell back asleep, but I was frightened and very awake. I was now sat up in bed, sitting in diffused moonlight. All was still and silent. I got up, wanting to look at the Christmas tree. Christmas trees always brought me comfort, and that's what I craved after such a fright. From the foot of the bed, you could look out the room as the door was open, through the short hallway and into the front room, and a picture window, maybe 25 to 30 feet away. They had a mid-century aluminium Christmas tree in the front of that window. Not because retro is cool, but it was literally the same tree that they had been using since the 50s. As I looked out there to the tree with lights at 3 a.m., it sat along with some presents quietly. Only filtered bluish streetlight gently filled the room with a weak illumination. However, something was different now. Sitting next to the aluminium tree was a pair of 2 huge black Doberman pincers, sitting silently staring straight at me. The weird thing? They had no pets. I jumped back in bed, threw the covers over myself, and eventually fell asleep and woke up in the morning sunshine, making the aluminium tree warmly shimmer. I think about what happened that night from time to time. It's the first paranormal encounter that I've ever had, and at that point in my life, I don't think I even had a concept of ghosts or the paranormal. I was simply a 5-year-old with a limited understanding of the world and an unlimited imagination. Was there something paranormal shaking that bed and presenting those enormous dogs? This last holiday season, I had been spending quite some time at my grandparents' house. My grandma and I drifted apart a few years prior, but we got really close last year. She always decked the house out with Christmas stuff, but couldn't last year because of health issues and ailments, so I offered to spend a good week putting up every single bauble and ornament she had. I'd like to say here that my grandmother and her mother were very close. They spent hours, days and weeks putting together Christmas for my family, and it was something very special that they shared. Almost all of my grandma's Christmas items are handmade. With that being said, my grandma spent a lot of time telling me about her mother. I never really got to meet her due to a family feud, but she sounded really lovely. Sometimes my grandma would say that she thought her mother would come and visit sometimes, because she would smell cooking in the kitchen when no one was there. Sometimes cigarette smoke, which her mother had smoked, when no one but she was home, and my grandparents didn't smoke. I found this really interesting and quite endearing, but I'm not sure I put too much stock into it. One day after putting the last few ornaments on the tree, I stood back to admire the lights and ornaments. They were all handmade by my grandmother and her mother, and I suddenly felt a cool breeze on my neck. And it's gonna sound weird, but I felt a presence next to me. In my mind's eye, I saw my great-grandmother standing next to me. I was just frozen in place, kind of weirded out. I saw exactly what she was wearing. A pink sweater, and she was also looking at the tree. I honestly felt like I was standing there frozen for a long time, when I started to smell something. Even though I maybe met my great-grandmother 3 times in my whole life, I somehow knew it was the smell of her perfume. I really started to freak out here, mostly with excitement. I thought I was going crazy. I had to get my grandma so she could experience this too. I knew what this meant for her, so I ran as fast as I could out to the garage to get my grandma. I was running and jumping over boxes and tubs of Christmas decorations, which I'm pretty sure looked weird. I found my grandma in the depths of the garage, digging out even more decor. Quite out of breath, I managed to say, "Grandma, come quick, you've got to see this." So she and I found our way back to the Christmas tree and said, "So, do you smell anything?" She paused for a second, looking down in contemplation. After a second, she looked up at me with tears in her eyes. "It's my mother's perfume." She had to sit down after this and spent the rest of the day crying and telling me stories of her mother. She told me every year for Christmas, before her father died, he would buy her mother a very small but expensive bottle of perfume. Every year, somehow, she would make it last until the following year. This continued until her father passed. I've never seen my grandmother cry like this before. It was a happy yet sad type of crying. Melancholy tears of times past. Slowly but surely the perfume had wafted throughout the house, lingering in the living room where we were still sitting, until it finally just faded away. I almost think it was her mother's presence, comforting her while she was sad. I'd be lying if I said that this situation hasn't touched me as well. That night I lay in bed thinking of the day's events. I drifted off to sleep eventually, but was awakened scared. I could feel that something was in my room, and it was freaking me out. I immediately started to pray over and over. I'm not super religious, but I was asking God to get rid of all the bad things in my room. Ghosts, spirits, or whatever. It didn't seem to work. I was still feeling scared, so I prayed that He remove all spirits from my room so that I could sleep, good or bad. I laid there frozen, barely even breathing due to fear. Suddenly I felt a hand touch my foot. It flattened the blanket and everything. My eyes shot open and my anxiety skyrocketed. But I kind of felt peaceful after this. It was almost like someone was leaving the room and gave me a pat as they left. I will always wonder if it was my great-grandmother. This happened around Christmas time, when I was around 7. I was looking for my dad to ask him for something, so naturally, I went straight to my parents' bedroom. I have a huge family, 8 in total, 5 siblings, myself, and my parents, and we lived in a small house. Before going into my parents' bedroom, I saw my siblings out in the living room, and also the front yard, and my mum was in the kitchen, so I assumed my dad must be in the bedroom. I walked down the hallway to their room, and the door was wide open. There's nothing strange in here, but then I heard something rustling around in the closet. Ah, he's trying to hide the presents for Christmas, I thought. My parents always hide our Christmas presents in the closet before we set up the tree. So I walk towards the closet door, but still cannot see inside, and the rustling noises start to become more intense, as if clothes were being thrown to the ground. I speak out and say, "Dad?" I get no response. I repeat, "Hey, Dad?" Then I hear the most cynical and unfamiliar voice I've ever encountered say, "What?" If you were to imagine a demon talking to you, that's what it sounded like. That's the only way I can describe how this voice sounded. It scared me out of my mind, because I knew that my dad did not sound like that. So I ran to the front of the house. I see my siblings still playing in the living room and outside. My mum is still in the kitchen, and then my dad walks in from the garage. I still have no idea who or what responded to me from my parents' closet. It was Christmas Eve, and I was a freshman in high school. My family had been split up for some time, so normally we'd trade off Christmas Day and Christmas Eve every year. And this year, I had come home early from my grandparents' Christmas party, while everyone else was at my aunt and uncle's celebrating at another party. When I was dropped off, my cousins offered to stay with me for a few hours, but I declined. I thought I could watch some of my new DVDs and get some alone time in the house, which is a rarity. I had noticed an unfamiliar car parked on the street, but didn't think anything of it, considering it was Christmas Eve and probably a neighbor's relatives or something. After I got inside and locked the door, grabbed snacks and started to settle down. I hadn't been home for more than 15 minutes when there was a knock at the door. I unlocked the door and opened it a crack to see a man standing there. Dark hair, glasses, slightly overweight, and dressed casually. He didn't look like much of a threat, but my stomach dropped and he asked, "I was wondering about the car. Is it for sale?" I told him I didn't think so. "Is there someone here I can talk to it about?" I said, and quite stupidly, "No, you can come back at another time," and shut the door and turned the lock as fast as I possibly could. He reached for the handle immediately and started pounding on the door. I heard a string of profanities and the pounding stopped. Terrified, I was crawling on the floor to the phone, hoping he wouldn't be able to see me through one of the windows. Then I heard the noises. Our house had an open garage door, and it led through to the laundry room, where the door lock was broken and no one had bothered to fix it. Just then I heard a man yell, and I saw the man through the window run to his car and drive off. My uncle had gotten him just in time and scared the man off. Who knew what would have happened if he hadn't have made it home in time? Sadly, we didn't get the number plate, and nothing ever came of it. But I'll never be home alone on a holiday again. This story happened in early December of 2018. It was Christmas break, so I was back home from college and staying with my parents. I live on the second floor of my house, just above the sliding back doors. It's a fairly heavy door, so anytime anyone opens it or closes it, I can hear it. Our house was built in 1940, so it creaks a lot, and sound travels through the walls pretty easily. We live in a relatively safe part of town too. The strangest people we've ever gotten are magazine solicitors, and even they stopped coming around a few years ago. We've never come anywhere close to a break-in. Admittedly, I'd gotten into the bad habit of smoking weed out my bedroom window after my parents went to bed. Most nights by midnight, I had my window open anywhere from 30 minutes to 2 hours. It depended on how tired I was, how cold it was, as well as other things. I would leave it open to air the room out while I watched Netflix or listened to music. I always listened to whatever I was watching through one headphone. This way, I had an open ear to hear if anyone got up and started walking in the hallway. That night, I had gone through my routine and was laying in bed watching YouTube when the alarm of our house went off. It was this blaring to all hell alarm, so the entire house was up and ready to go. My primary concern, which I realize is ridiculous, was not someone breaking into our house, but that my parents might smell the residual weed smell in my room. My dad poked his head through my door to make sure he knew where I was before he scoped the downstairs and turned off the alarm. When he knew I was okay, he asked me to go into his room with my mum. I don't think he noticed that my room's window was open. After he cleared the downstairs, he did a sweep of the front and backyard to make sure no one was hiding in the shadows. He's pretty paranoid about most things, but honestly, I appreciated his thoroughness. He came back up, told us he didn't find anything, and we all went back to bed. I went back to my room and debated whether or not I should close my window. Stupidly, I decided not to. I figured my dad had swept the yard, so it was fine. Plus, my parents were awake, and I would probably freak out if they heard my window sliding closed. I decided to wait a bit and let them get a little less conscious before making any window-related noises. About 15 minutes later, just as I was about to get up and close my window, the alarm goes off again. My dad rushes downstairs to turn it off, just as I slide my window closed and push both locks back in place. A few minutes pass, and my dad comes knocking on my door. I open it and he tells me, "Hey, I think it's just the wind. Don't worry about the alarm." It had been a pretty windy night, and the door had a little give in its locking mechanism, i.e., it could be pulled about half an inch before you felt the lock, so we decided to write it off for the time being. The next morning, my dad decides to check the alarm systems app on his phone. To our horror, it showed the door being opened and closed 14 times before the alarm triggered. Like I said, it's a heavy door. We've had windier nights and never had the alarm triggered or seen the sensor opened and closed 14 times. My dad was telling our neighbor about what happened the night before, trying to figure out if it had actually been the wind. Our neighbor told us that in fact he'd caught someone briefly entering his backyard on his security camera. He told us he'd probably freaked out once he saw the camera and moved onto our house. Just imagining whoever it was standing at our back door, right below my open window, triggering the alarm, hiding somewhere, and probably watching my dad scope out the backyard and then doing it all over again, while I laid oblivious in my bed, was enough for me to stop smoking my midnight sessions entirely. After this, we had a series of weird events happen at midnight. The next night, a woman rang our doorbell at the stroke of midnight and gave my dad his wallet, which he hadn't recognized had been missing. A few nights earlier, the alarm triggered at the back door again, and then on Christmas Eve I was home alone while my family was at the midnight church service, and the alarm triggered twice back to back in a disturbingly similar time span. At that time, I didn't bother asking which door had been triggered. I didn't want to know. I took away a fairly simple life lesson. Lock your doors, lock your windows, and set your house alarm, even if you think you're safe. 2 years ago on Christmas Eve, a friend of mine died in a car accident. His sister was driving with him to their dad's house as the parents are divorced, and his car hit an ice patch, slid, and got hit by an oncoming car. His sister was seriously injured and has since made a full recovery, but he passed away. This absolutely ruined me, and I had to go to therapy for a while. About 6 months later, I started hearing a metal chiming sort of noise when I laid in bed at night. I thought it was coming from my brother's room, which is right next to mine, because he's a swimmer and has tons of medals hung on a shelf with pegs. I thought somehow his fan or something was making them hit each other. So I went to his room, but they were totally still. Mind you, it's 1 a.m. when this happened, and he was fast asleep. This continued for months, at least 3 times a week, and always at night between 1 to 3 in the morning. I'd hear chiming, go into his room, or check around mine, and could never find out where it was coming from. I'm embarrassed to say that it was beginning to scare me. I eventually decided to buy a sage bundle and sage the house. I felt crazy doing it, and it's embarrassing to admit that I even did do it, but it totally worked. The chiming completely stopped for months and never came back. I recently told this story to a very religious and spiritual friend, and she told me that good spirits will never try to scare you, and it was possibly my friend that passed, trying to let me know that he was well. After this, I felt bad for saging the house and being scared. I decided to say something like, "Hey, I know it's you who are making the bell sounds, and I'm not scared anymore. I'd love another sign from you." And they started up again. Every now and then, when I'm laying in bed about to fall asleep, I'll hear a few isolated chimes, then gentle and sound like a quiet bell. I always smile and feel at peace, and I love hearing it. Ghosts and spirits are often portrayed as bad and scary things, but I don't feel that way. It's honestly helped me heal a lot from his loss. I know I sound like a nut job, but I truly believe it's his spirit, letting me know that it's all right. It's Christmas Eve 1990, and as a tradition, I always slept in my brother's room, because the door to the attic was in my room. Excited to see what Santa had brought me, I quickly went to sleep. In the middle of the night, the sounds of the closet door in my brother's room opening woke me up, and as I opened my eyes, there stood a tall man dressed in dark-colored clothes, just walking past me. Though I should have been scared out my mind, I wasn't, and I felt at ease and comfortable, like I knew him, though this was the only time I had ever seen him, as he passed through the door leading out of my brother's room and onto the upstairs landing that connected our 2 rooms and a bathroom. I jumped up to follow him, but as I got to the landing, he was no longer there. I looked to the bathroom and in my room, but nothing was there. Then I heard something down the stairs, so I looked over the balcony to the living room, down the stairs, and it was dark. But I could make out the fact our Santa gifts had been delivered in the glow of the Christmas lights, and figured I had almost gotten caught by Santa. So I excitedly woke my brother up, and like 2 normal kids on Christmas, we ran downstairs and excitedly woke up my mum and dad. It took a few days before the memory of what woke me up came back to me, and it took years before I ever told anyone about it. One day, me and my mum just happened to be talking about ghosts and things like that, when I told her the story of that Christmas Eve in 1990. And as I described the man to her, she smiled and showed me this really old black and white photo of a man standing next to a horse and plow. It was the man I had seen. Turns out everyone in the family had seen him, but hadn't told me because I was young, and they didn't want to scare me. The man in the picture was my mum's granddad, and he had passed away before either me and my brother had been born. My first experience of the paranormal, and it was family, explains why I was never scared. Here I am some 28 years later, and I can still remember that night like it were yesterday. My grandparents have a big house in England, due to my granddad having a lot of sad money. By sad money, I mean he got it from inheritance because most of his family died off when he was young, leaving him to retire early. Before I was born, it's where the majority of my family stayed. My granddad, step-grandma, 4 uncles, black Labrador, and my mum. So a very busy house. This house wasn't too old when my granddad bought it, maybe 20 years old, and it didn't look freaky. In fact, it looked quite modern for an English house. For quite a while, everything was alright, until the first incident happened. The first incident wasn't scary. Frankly, it could have been a prank done by any of the family. It started off in the smallest room, known as the kids' room. There was a lock on the outside of the door to prevent the dog getting in, as this door was easy for him to push open. Every time a family member, no matter who, would be locked in after they enter. This meant they wouldn't be able to unlock the door as they were on the inside. Most times they would call out and bang on the door until someone came, but sometimes there would be no one home, and the person on the inside would have to use the landline to call a nearby family member to come home and let them out. Now, my family isn't very superstitious, especially my granddad, who has 0 tolerance for anything. So everyone used to blame my mum. I know it's just her word, but she promised the family that even years later it wasn't her. My mom wasn't superstitious until she had to spend the night in this small room, as when she went traveling, one of her brothers took over her room. The second incident occurred over 2 of the nights she slept in that room. She claimed one night she woke up around 1 or 2 a.m. and saw a very tall figure next to the door go out the room. She thought it might have been her eyes not properly adjusting after waking up, so she lay back down and turned to face the wall. She then turned around again, about 10 minutes later, seeing the room much clearer in the dark, and the figure was still there. She thought this time it was one of her brothers, so she called out to them. There was no response, and she started to get angry and turned on her lamp. Nothing appeared next to the door, so she slowly turned off her lamp, a bit shaken up, and went back to sleep. The next night, the same thing happened, but that night she was less anxious and brushed it off, never really talking about it. But on the third night, waking up again, there was nothing. No figure at the door. She thought it was weird, but she didn't really mention it until after I was born and came to stay over one Christmas holiday. This was the third incident. As I was the youngest of around 6, I had to stay in the kids' room. Christmas Eve came, and I woke up at around midnight. I turned around in the bed and noticed a figure at the side of the door that scared me. I covered my face with the duvet and stayed there for 5 minutes. As a child, I was very superstitious, listening to all the rumors of ghosts, so I was too scared to get out of bed and go past it to the door. After those 5 minutes, I decided to face my fears and go to Mum, but when I took my head out of the covers, there was nothing by the door anymore. I came to realize it might be my granddad's, so I brushed it away. This happened until Boxing Day, with occurrence from 12 till 4 in the morning. It became a routine to me and never thought to bring it up with my mum until this year. It was the summer holidays, and I was spending the holidays at home, which is only 10 minutes away from my granddad's house, as I moved about 4 years ago. I decided to visit my cousins who were all staying at my granddad's, and when I got there, my youngest cousin of age 6 came running up to me and said, "Why is there always a man standing by the door at night?" This sent chills running down my spine, and then I began to talk to my mum about it, who then talked to my family. We all ended up having weird experiences in the small room, and ever since have all called it the naughty kids room, to scare the boys, saying if they're bad, they'll have to go into that room at night, and we'll make the strange man come out. Let's just say my cousins are well behaved now. This story took place only just last week before Christmas, when me and my friends decided to go out for a few drinks. It was a usual night, but busier than normal, but a great atmosphere. We went to the usual bar we go to that does special craft beers that we love. While in there, my other college friend was there that I hadn't seen in a while, and he was catching up with them. He suggested that we go to this new bar across the street. We finished our drinks and went across to this new place, and it was amazing. The place was jam-packed and had a great welcoming atmosphere. We managed to get a table, and when we ordered, I had to use the bathroom. While walking to the bathroom, I passed this black-haired girl who seen me and said hi while checking me out. I said hi back and proceeded to go to the bathroom. I returned when my college friend said, "I have to go." We said our goodbyes and finished our drinks, and my other friend suggested we go to this late-night bar, and we left. Getting in, the place was quieter than usual. It was mainly couples, but we stayed and ordered drinks, and a few hours passed when these 3 girls came in and were at the bar ordering. They were very drunk. And who was with them? The black-haired girl. She saw me, smiled at me, and I smiled back. About 10 minutes later, she came over to my table and said my name. I just looked at her and looked at my friends, which also looked puzzled. What scared me the most was what she said next. She told me my address, hometown, who I was, and all my family. Puzzled, I asked her, did she know me through one of my relations? And she said, "No, I just know you." I'd never seen her in my whole life, just in the other bar earlier. She started talking to my friend, and then I saw her other friend look in horror and walked over and grabbed the black-haired girl away from us. We just looked at each other stunned, confused as to what happened. We decided to go out to the smoking area. While walking to the table, I passed this small blonde woman who called me by my name. I said hi to her, and puzzled, I looked back in the direction where she was, and the girl she was next to said, "You called him by his name." They swiftly left. We soon left and nothing crazy happened since. Nearly everywhere I go, people always come up to me and talk to me. I seem to have a friendly face, but I have my few shares of creepy encounters. But this story has puzzled me more than scared me. How did they know me? This happened to me while I was living in New Jersey, at least 6 years ago. I lived literally 30 feet away from the borders of New Jersey and New York. I am a normal guy mostly, but people around me tell me that I used to say a lot of weird things. One time while driving in a wooded area of rural New York, I said to my friends, "I wonder how many bodies are buried here that haven't been discovered yet." I felt like it was just a question, while being morbid at best. Not a great way to make people feel comfortable, as they all told me to shut up because they all got goosebumps. So even back then, a lot of people knew that I was more attuned to the nether side of the world. Thankfully, in my opinion, my ability began to fade. As I grew older, the mysterious nature of our world started to blend with our natural world that we see and hear. But one time, for a short moment, it made me question reality altogether. Back when I had a friend who was a very caring person, every time the holidays would come like clockwork, he would graciously invite me to his family's house for dinners and events alike. But this one Christmas Eve felt a little different, like I had a purpose to be there. Something or someone goaded me into being there that night. I was living alone by myself at the time, with my mum being in California and my sister in Ohio. It was good to just get calls from them during the holidays back then. I felt like I was living my life the way I wanted to. After coming back from work to my small room that I rented from this lady and her kid, I started to wind down from the ordinary day and drank some beers while watching Netflix. Time began to slowly fade away, and I was mindlessly watching the computer screen when I got a text from my friend, Kevin. Kevin also lived with his mum and sister one town over. He asked if I wanted to come over for Christmas Eve dinner, and since I only had packaged food on hand, I said okay. I thought the timing was a little weird, however. He said he'd come over around 9:30, and my family always ate earlier in the evening, but I shrugged it off and decided to go. I walked out my place at 9:15, and a short while later drove to his house. I hummed a little Christmas tune that was playing over the car radio, and not long after I parked my car in front of his house, I felt bad just waltzing into someone's home. So I grabbed what little wine I kept in my closet as a gift to his mum. It was my favorite bottle of Cabernet Sauvignon from my home state. Kevin's mum greeted me at the door, and she gave me a great big hug. For a short-statured woman, she always had this presence. Just being around her made you feel safe and warm. Kevin's house had a weird floor plan. When you enter through the front door, you're entering into a winding staircase and corridor. To the left was the bottom living space and storage room, and the door to the garage. To the right, you go up the staircase into the main living space with a warm fireplace and kitchen. It may sound strange, but when you enter through the front door, you would always hear a low grumbling or moaning towards the left. Kevin had a dog that wasn't very guest-friendly, and when she felt someone else other than her family, she would always lie down on the couch that was in the storage room. I thought to myself, well, Merry Christmas to you too, grumpy old dog. I always hoped she'd warm up to me eventually, but I guess it just wasn't in the plans after all. So we all headed towards the main living space or the kitchen for a warm drink. His mum was serving either beer or hot chocolate, and I'm confident I had both. Now, the dinner wasn't served at Kevin's house because every holiday they would walk down the street and go to their aunt's house, or previously his grandfather's house at the beginning of the street. Kevin had a younger cousin called Zeke, and to be quite honest, I haven't the faintest clue what his actual name was. We just called him that. Not that I really cared, of course. Zeke's mum was a saint, but his dad was an abuser. He didn't raise his hand on his wife, but verbally abused her since the birth of their son. Zeke gradually started to mimic his father and also berated his mother, which aggravated me to no end. Kevin and I used to make fun on his behalf as a joke or a small playback of him for dishonoring his mother. Zeke's mum was a great cook, and she also made lots of money as a major company accountant. I feel like her husband was always jealous about that. That nasty fat ass of a man. So her food was incredibly satisfying, and she cared for me like she was my own aunt. Anyway, after dinner, Zeke's mum and Kevin's family walked back to Kevin's house for a warm refreshment. I had hoped it was just a warm refreshment, but something curious was about to unravel. At the house, it was close to 11:30 now, and I began thinking it was time to head back, but Kevin actually told me I could stay a little longer. At the time, I thought, why not? It's not like anyone was waiting for me at my room. After grabbing warm refreshments, we all sat in the upper living space. There was Kevin's mum, Kevin's sister, and her friend, Kevin's uncle, not the fat guy, and Kevin's other cousin, in a perfect circle. It looked planned. Now, right before the actual thing happened, Kevin's mum explained to me that they all sat together on Christmas Eve to think about all the people they cared about who have passed and hoped that their spirits would join them on the holy night. She pretty much told me that nothing really ever happens, but they feel the warmness in the air and wish for a happy new year. Now, this would have been just fine, but among them was a conduit to the other side. Yep, they had a specific reason they asked me to come to dinner. I'm still always thankful for their care while I lived by myself in those days, but that night was something completely different. I was about to find out exactly what, in an unimaginable way. So as the clock was ticking, I began to feel woozy, like something in the air or atmosphere was beginning to change. Not exactly bad, but not really saintly either. I began to hear someone trying to clear out their throat in a corner between me and Kevin's sister. Clearly there wasn't anyone sitting there, but for me I could hear this person. It sounded like she was trying to cough, but nothing came out, or perhaps she was clearing her throat. I told Kevin's mum that there was someone next to me that was doing that, and her eyes became widened for a second, and she said Aunt Ruth was here with us. I asked Kevin who Aunt Ruth was, and he started to tell me he had a great aunt who passed at least a decade ago from throat cancer. She had one of these holes in her throat, just so she could breathe. I think it's called a stoma. And I began to sweat in my palms exactly when he finished telling me the story. Everyone was sounding ecstatic, except for me. I only felt dread. Then at the corner of my eye, I saw a small shadow darting from Kevin's mum's room. I started to sigh constantly and said to Kevin I was glad to see his other dog, Barney. I always had a love-hate relationship with Barney, because unfortunately while trying to pat his head, I accidentally poked him in the eye once. But Kevin sat next to me rigidly, looking as if he were in shock, and said to me that it couldn't be. I suddenly started to feel another pang of dread in my stomach, as Kevin told me that Barney passed away in the summer. I said it couldn't be, because I'd just seen his shadow as he ran towards his mum. Then Kevin wildly reported to everyone what I had just seen. They began to exclaim that it was incredible, or said that they felt blessed to have their dog back home one last time. But I sat in my chair and started to feel sick, shaking a little and just trying to process what was going on. That feeling of sickness only lasted for a second. Suddenly, out of nowhere in my eyesight, the one spot between Kevin and his mum began to shine. It was so bright I couldn't make out what it was, but I felt a very warm sensation, and it felt like someone was sitting there. The whole room enveloped in this warm glow and made me feel relaxed, even though something unbelievable was happening to me that night. I felt like St. Nicholas or the Holy Spirit was in front of me, but this being began to speak through me. It asked me to tell Kevin's family that everything will be alright, and the year after will have nothing but great news. I told Kevin exactly what I was feeling, seeing and speaking. Kevin's mum started to whimper and sob about Kevin's grandfather, who was the pillar of the family. Now, the weird encounter wasn't finished. As I saw this light begin to extend its light to Zeke's mum, it asked me to tell her that things will only get better from here, and that she should not be afraid of the darkness that lingers in her home. As I began to tell her exactly those words, Kevin's mum and Zeke's mum began to sob together openly and loudly. Before this presence vanished, like how it appeared, it showed me its form. The being of light had a clear outline of an elderly man in a military uniform. He thanked me in my mind, and also told me to tell Kevin that he was proud of him for following in his footsteps. Kevin, after hearing what I repeated from this being, held his face in his hands, and his eyes began to well up. Then, it was gone. Now in my head this whole thing lasted only a few moments, but when I checked the time, almost 3 hours had passed. It was 2:30 a.m. when I rose from my chair. All the family members either gave me hugs or pats on the back. But to me, it wasn't exactly something easy to swallow. It was either something amazing or terrifying. I can't really wrap my head around it. Should I feel like I was used, or was I a gatekeeper to the other side? I only had one more question that was left unsaid. What did it mean by the darkness? What lingers in Zeke's house? Who exactly sat in the chair that night? And what about the shadow? Do dogs even have souls or spirits? I can tell you it was the first and last time hanging out with Kevin's family on Christmas Eve. I think I was introduced into a seance without acknowledging the harm that could come out of it. I'm still not 100% sure whether or not I should be happy to have been of service. It's really strange to see something that others can't perceive. I also feel that the evening could have unraveled in a much different fashion, as well as a door that I'm not ready to cross or bear. This was roughly a decade and some change ago. I was in 6th grade and was home alone because of Christmas break and divorced parents. I lived in one of the bigger towns of Alaska and lived in a middle-class neighborhood. Houses spaced pretty far apart with very long driveways down each, but the next-door neighbors knew us well enough to know if something didn't look right. It was around 4 p.m. I believe, and my mum was off working early, but stopped to get some groceries. Kind of a gift in itself to not go shopping. I hadn't grown out of my back problems yet, and couldn't stand walking around for over an hour. Anyway, I was in my room watching a movie with Jackie Chan, Around the World in 80 Days, when I heard a knock on the door. I didn't answer, thinking whoever it would be would just be asking for my mum and dad about solar panels or something. But when I heard it getting louder and louder, and around the 3rd time it got louder, I started to get scared. I was always told to call the cops if people would act suspicious, but I guess I was too terrified in that moment. Being in pajamas and enjoying my favorite movie at the time, I just didn't feel like it. So, not knowing what to do while two guys are literally banging on the door, I call my mum and I tell her what's going on. And she says it's probably just Mormons. Now for you guys, that might be a normal thing. But I live in Alaska and I don't even know what a Mormon is. And to not worry. I told her that it kept getting louder and I'd thought they might break the door down. It was still pretty big and thick stained glass at chest height, but she told me to calm down. But then she heard it. This only took place within about a minute, but every 10 seconds or so, the banging would get louder. This is when she began to freak out. She told me to stay right in my room with the door locked and to not make a sound as she called the cops. So we hang up, and while I wait for my dad to answer my call, I'm looking around for anything in my room. I grabbed a T-ball bat and sat on my bed, freaking out. And I didn't have a window facing the front of the house, just the side. Finally, my dad answers and I tell him what's going on, and that Mum was calling the cops right now. He wasn't legally allowed to be on the property, but he's very protective. He lived very close to the police station at the time and raced over to me. While I'm waiting and waiting for the police to arrive or my mum, I decide to peek my head out. The way the house was set up, I could stalk out my bedroom door and see the backyard, and without walking more than 2 steps, able to peek out of the corner and see through the living room bay window. I saw that they'd reversed their car almost right up to the garage door, and I could partially see through the door 2 men pounding away at it. I stayed there and saw the first guy send the other around back, and saw his face as he went to walk around the house. I hid before he could see me and waited. I realized after what they were doing, and the one around the back tried to open our glass sliding doors on the balcony. Thankfully, not only was it locked, but it also had a piece of wood, so even if they overpowered the lock, they couldn't open it more than an inch. He started to try to break it as well, and then my mum called me back, crying and wanting to know if I was okay. She was pulled over at the store's gas station and said that the police would be there ASAP and that she was making her way right now. After about a minute of them both trying the front and back door, they regrouped back near the front door, and I was really tired of them making me feel scared. So I walked out of my room to the front door, yelling at them in a tank top and shorts holding a bat. They didn't hear me until I was right at the door and spooked them. They ran to their car to drive away, and only when they got into the car did I open the door to keep yelling at them. I forgot what I was yelling, but they drove off. My mum got home a few minutes after and held me until my dad came, and I went out to his truck and showed him I was all right and told him how I scared them off. He hugged me, gave me a kiss, and left before him and my mum could fight over him being there. Thankfully, she didn't care at all, and she kept talking to me about the men until the cops came half an hour later. He didn't seem interested in talking to me until I told him that I could easily tell him the face of the guy at the front door, and a little of the other guy as well. He said he suspected that they were a group that had been breaking in the past 2 weeks, stealing Christmas presents and other stuff. They were found a few weeks later and were linked to over 10 burglaries. The same night they tried to break in, I had my best friend come over, and we sat up all night with my bat and his. On Christmas Day 2016, I participated in a gift exchange with my mum and her boyfriend's family. Long story short, I ended up getting this pretty good bottle of this vanilla-flavored whiskey. I'd like to add that this took place in northern Alberta country, where it's pretty secluded and cold at this time of year, and I do mean cold. Now the real story. So towards the end of the day, I decided to go have myself a fire and taste my new whiskey, at our dugout just down the road. I was there hanging out for about an hour by myself, and everything was normal as usual. It's dark and starry at night, hardly a breeze in the woods, and it's quiet with the exception of the occasional vehicle passing on the highway right beside this area. I finally decide to crack open the hooch and mix myself a whiskey and cola. As I'm sipping my drink, the flames of the fire die down as most of the wood was burnt up, so I add a log or two and begin to blow the embers to raise the flames. As I blow, I hear this loud, percussive knock. Not cracking, not popping, but a knock. Wood on wood. No mistake about it. I estimate the sound to be roughly within 20 yards. It was crystal clear and loud. My heart is beating 1,000,000 miles an hour. My grip tightens around my utility shovel, the only protection I have, and I remain as still as possible with my head facing the blackness of the woods where I heard the knock. I have no flashlight to shine in the area, aside from my iPhone light, which was useless. I wait for whoever or whatever it was to make a move. I'm convinced that somehow someone stopped on the highway and snuck up on me without noticing and was trying to mess with me. I should add that my town is quite rough. A lot of criminal activity happens here. Thievery, robberies, occasional shooting, as there's a decent amount of crazy folk here. So as I'm waiting for whoever/whatever to make a move, I consider yelling out, "Who's there?" I resist that urge, however, as I was so amped up that if someone was going to answer my call, I was sure that I would charge and seriously injure the person out of fear. So I sit out quietly for a few minutes and listen. After about 2 minutes without hearing anything, I decide to pack up. I very gently and slowly gather up my cup, whiskey bottle and garbage into my backpack and make my way to the quad, all while listening and watching that same area. The quad was parked about 5 yards ahead of me in the direction of the knock. As I turn on my quad, the lights are shining in that direction. I take a quick look at the woods ahead of me to see if I can notice anything, but there's nothing. So I hightail it out of there and quickly park the quad in the garage and head inside for bed. I get up the next day and head back out to look for tracks, as it had snowed Christmas Day. A fresh, new 1 to 2 inch blanket of snow covered the land, and I was convinced I'd find the tracks of whoever/whatever made the knock. I walk over to the area and see nothing, so I decide to circle the whole dugout just to be sure there wasn't anything. I didn't see a single disturbance in the snow aside from my own tracks, not even any rabbit tracks. I was completely alone. I tried to come up with an explanation, but none make any sense to me, except for one, a person. No footprints, as I would have heard crunching in the snow trying to sneak up. 2, an animal, but there are no tracks. What animal can grab a piece of wood and nod? Could it have been freezing, falling, a big branch falling, a Sasquatch, a spirit? All these possibilities raced through my mind. When my mind reflected on the spirit option, could it have been my dog or my grandmother telling me to go home right now? As if I'd have stayed out there, I wouldn't have made it home alive. Although I didn't plan on getting drunk, I'm a lightweight, and the possibility of me getting drunk and nodding off was a serious possibility. This is also the first time I've ever drank in the woods. I've been out at night 1,000,000 times before. I never had anything like this happen until I brought booze out. I'd like to finish this story by informing you all that I lost a friend about a year after this incident, due to drinking and freezing to death. I can't help but think of some wild, crazy theories that was him from the future. I'm sure he'd laugh at that theory. I certainly miss that guy. Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so very much for listening. I hope that you enjoyed tonight's festive stories. I certainly did. 20 stories. I really wasn't planning on doing this many, to be honest, but the amount of stories that I found just needed to be told, and they couldn't wait another year. So I do hope that you enjoyed tonight's video. If you did, don't forget to let me know by dropping it in the comment section and doing a like and subscribing and stuff. In any case, it's been great to have you here tonight. A huge thank you as always to my amazing patrons whose names are on screen. If you are interested in joining, you know what to do. Link in the description, and for little as $1 a month, you'll really be helping me out. Merry Christmas after all. I do hope that each and every one of you had a reasonably nice holiday. I suppose that's the best we can ask for. Now, a great holiday. And hopefully this was a nice little addition to listen to for anyone still sticking about. As for me, I'm probably enjoying Christmas right now with all my family. Speaking of which, there will not be a video tomorrow. I'm going to take the day off to have even more family time. And as this video is twice as long, I thought I deserved it. So I'll see you on what we British call Boxing Day, the 26th, for some spooks yet to be determined. But for now, guys, I'm gonna sign off. Stay awesome, Merry Christmas, and I'll see you in the next one.